Evening, a warm London cafe, golden lights, soft chatter. Daniel Hayes, a 41-year-old single father, walks in with hesitation. This blind date was arranged by his coworkers, but as he sits down, he notices something different. The woman is silent. She doesn't speak. She doesn't hear. The waiter sets down 2 glasses. The woman smiles, then begins to move her hands. Signing. Daniel doesn't look away. He watches her with intense focus. And then, he signs back in perfect rhythm. She freezes. Her eyes shimmer with shock. This wasn't a joke anymore. Daniel understood every word. Watch him closely. Now. Believe. Her. The truth matters. Daniel Hayes was a man who lived in the quiet, calculated architecture of logistics. At 41, his face was a map of weary resilience and silent dedication, etched with the subtle lines of a man who preferred the predictable flow of a shipping manifest to the chaotic, often cruel noise of modern social life. He was a senior operations coordinator for a major freight firm in East London. In an industry built on speed, volume, and relentless communication, Daniel was an outlier. He was the quiet man. He arrived at his desk exactly at 8:55 a.m., processed thousands of global shipments with surgical precision, and vanished the moment the clock hit 5 p.m. His office was a sea of gray cubicles and fluorescent lights, where the air was constantly vibrating with the sound of ringing phones and aggressive negotiations. To the younger, louder brokers in the office, Daniel was a mystery, or worse, a punchline. They saw a man who didn't attend the Friday night pub crawls or participate in the office gossip. They mocked his ironed cotton shirts and his sensible shoes. They called him the machine because they assumed he was devoid of emotion, a human processor who only cared about fuel costs, port delays, and delivery windows. They didn't see the man who spent his evenings building cardboard castles or helping with complex math homework in a house that was often too quiet. Daniel was a single father. 6 years ago, his world had been hollowed out when his wife, Maria, passed away. Since that day, Daniel had systematically dismantled his old high-pressure life. He had been a rising star in the international trade, but he walked away from the 60-hour weeks. He needed to be the father who was there for the science projects, the bad dreams, and the Saturday morning pancakes. He didn't need a corner office. He needed to be a hero in a small, warm apartment filled with Lego sets and half-finished drawings. He chose a role beneath his capability because it bought him time, and time was the only currency that mattered. The prank had started on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. A group of brokers, led by a man named Mark, who mistook a high commission for high character, had approached Daniel in the break room. Mark was the type of person who spoke in exclamation points and measured his worth by the size of his car. "Daniel, you're 41, man," Mark said, leaning against the counter with a predatory grin. "You can't spend every night with a 10-year-old in a spreadsheet. We've set you up. A blind date. Tomorrow night. She's an artist, she's beautiful, and she's looking for someone steady. Someone just like you." Daniel had hesitated. He didn't like the look in Mark's eyes, the flicker of suppressed laughter that Daniel couldn't quite place. He had grown accustomed to the subtle mockery, but he was tired of being the office ghost. He thought about his daughter, Lily, who had been asking why Daddy never went out to dinner with friends. He thought about the empty chair at his own table. He decided to say yes. He thought it was a genuine, if awkward, gesture of goodwill from his team. He didn't know that Mark and the others were currently in a private group chat, howling with laughter. They had found Elena Brooks through a local art registry where she showcased her minimalist illustrations. They knew she was deaf. They knew she used British Sign Language. They assumed that Daniel, the awkward, robotic technician who struggled with small talk, would sit there in a state of paralyzing embarrassment, unable to say a single word. They planned to ask him for a full report the next morning, just to watch him struggle to explain the silence of the night. To them, Elena's disability was a prop for their amusement. To them, Daniel's quietness was a weakness to be exploited. They were betting on a catastrophe, waiting to see the machine crash in a room where words didn't exist. On the evening of the date, Daniel stood outside the cafe, adjusting his collar. He was nervous, a feeling he hadn't felt in a decade. The London air was crisp, smelling of rain and city exhaust. He checked his phone one last time. A message from Lily. "Have fun, Dad. Don't talk about shipping containers too much. Love you." He smiled, took a deep breath, and stepped into the light. He saw Elena immediately. She was sitting by the window, her presence calm and vibrant. She was indeed beautiful, but there was a stillness about her that was different from the rest of the busy, shouting room. Daniel walked toward the table, unaware that he was about to participate in a joke that would end up being the most profound conversation of his life. The waiter placed 2 glasses of water on the table and retreated quickly, perhaps sensing the unusual atmosphere. Daniel sat down, offering a tentative, respectful smile. He watched Elena. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how his journey was. Instead, she looked him directly in the eye, her gaze searching, intelligent, and remarkably focused. She seemed to be measuring him, looking for the same things he was: honesty, patience, and a lack of ego. Then Elena raised her hands. Her fingers moved with a fluid, rhythmic grace, dancing in the small, warm space between them. She is using sign language to introduce herself, explaining that she couldn't hear the music playing in the background or the clatter of the kitchen. She expected Daniel to look confused. She expected him to reach for a pen and a napkin, his face flushing red as he realized the mistake his coworkers had made. She was used to that look, the look of a person who suddenly realizes they're in a room with a lock they don't have the key for. Daniel didn't move. He didn't look for a pen. He didn't look at the exit. He watched her hands with a clinical, intense focus, his mind processing the shapes, the speed, and the specific dialect of her movements. He waited for her to finish her thought. Then, without a second of hesitation, Daniel lifted his own hands. His movements weren't as artistic as hers. They were the movements of a man who learned out of necessity, not for performance. But they were precise. He signed back. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Elena. My name is Daniel. Please don't worry about the noise of the cafe. The silence here at this table is much better." Elena froze. Her hands dropped to the table as if they had lost their strength. She stared at him, her mouth slightly open, her eyes widening until they shimmered with a shock so profound it felt like a physical impact. She blinked twice as if checking to see if she was hallucinating. Then she signed again, much faster this time, her fingers nearly blurring. "How? How do you know BSL? You can hear the waiter, right?" Daniel nodded, a soft, sad smile touching his lips. He signed back, his movements becoming more comfortable as the memories of 10,000 bedtimes flooded in. "I can hear you, Elena, but I learned to listen with my eyes a long time ago. My daughter, Lily, she is 9. She was born profoundly deaf. I learned to sign before she could even walk. I didn't want her to grow up in a world where her father couldn't hear her heart. I didn't want her to be alone in the quiet." The atmosphere at the table shifted instantly. The blind date was gone, replaced by a bridge of shared experience. Elena let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief that seemed to vibrate through the table. She reached across the tablecloth and briefly touched Daniel's hand, a quick, grateful spark of connection. "Your co-workers," Elena signed, her expression turning cautious, her eyes searching his for a hidden motive. "They told me you were looking for someone different. They were very insistent. They seemed to think this would be funny. I was worried they were making fun of me. I almost didn't come." Daniel's brow furrowed. He realized then the true, jagged nature of the setup. The group chat, the smirks in the break room, the 2 serious jokes. They hadn't tried to help him. They had tried to humiliate both of them. They had used Elena's identity as a weapon to wound his dignity. They had treated a human being's life as a punchline for a Wednesday morning. He felt a cold, sharp surge of anger, but he didn't let it cloud his eyes. He looked at Elena, really looked at her, and saw the vulnerability she had been hiding behind her calm exterior. She was a successful illustrator, a woman of immense talent and independence. Yet she was still used to being the joke for people who didn't understand the depth of her world. "I am sorry," Daniel signed, his hands firm and sincere. "They are small people. They think that because they can speak, they have something to say. But tonight, I think they are the ones who are missing out. They don't know that the most honest conversations happen in the quiet. They don't know the frequency we're on." Elena smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed her entire face, making the golden cafe lights seem dim in comparison. She signed back, "I think you're right, Daniel. Tell me more about Lily. Does she like to draw too? Or is she more of a machine like her dad?" For the next 2 hours, the cafe around them vanished. The sound of the other customers, the ringing of the till, and the constant roar of the London traffic became irrelevant white noise. Daniel and Elena were in a world of their own, a world defined by the movement of hands and the honesty of the eyes. Daniel told her about Lily's love for the stars and her fierce determination to be an astronaut. Elena told him about her art, how she saw sounds as colors and rhythm as a series of visual patterns. Daniel realized that for 5 years, he had been living in a kind of silence that was lonely. He had the noise of the office and the noise of the city, but he hadn't had a real connection. Elena wasn't changing his life with sound. She was changing it with presence. She was the first person in years who didn't talk at him or around him. She talked to him. And as the evening wore on, Daniel Hayes, the logistics machine, realized that he had just found a soul that vibrated at the exact same frequency as his own. He realized the joke wasn't on him. It was on the people who were too loud to hear the truth. The conversation deepened as the coffee grew cold and the dessert plates were cleared. They weren't just exchanging facts anymore. They were sharing the unfiltered versions of themselves, the parts they usually kept locked away behind professional masks. Elena signed about the exhaustion of navigating a hearing world that often refused to meet her halfway. People see the silence and they assume the mind is empty. She made a gesture, signed her name with a sharp, pointed mark, rhythmic intensity that showed years of frustration. "They talk to my friends instead of me. They speak louder as if that helps me hear, or they just give up and walk away. It makes the world feel very large and very cold sometimes. You become a ghost in your own life." Daniel nodded, his expression full of a deep, aching empathy. "I see it every day with Lily. At the park, other kids sometimes pull away because they don't know how to play without shouting. They think she's broken because she doesn't respond to their noise. It breaks my heart, but then she just looks at me and signs, 'It's okay, Dad. They're just loud. They haven't learned to be quiet yet.' She has more grace at 9 than I have at 41. Elena laughed, a soft, melodic sound that Daniel found incredibly beautiful. It wasn't a sound of pity. It was a sound of recognition. "She sounds like a warrior. You've done a good job, Daniel. Most parents try to fix the silence with surgery or forced speech. You just learned to live in it with her. That's the greatest gift you could ever give a child. You gave her a home in your hands." They talked about the technicalities of logistics and the fluid dynamics of art. Daniel explained how he saw a global shipping network as a giant, interlocking puzzle of time and space, a system that required balance to function. Elena showed him sketches on her phone, vibrant, pulsing illustrations of London at night. She saw the city not as a series of buildings, but as a living organism of light and shadow. "I've spent 3 years being looked at as a CEO's assistant or a disabled artist by the galleries," Elena signed, her eyes reflecting the blue light of her screen. "But tonight, you're looking at me like I'm just Elena, like I'm someone with a story worth hearing." "Because that's who is here," Daniel replied, his hand steady. "I don't care about the labels Mark put on you, Elena. I care about the perspective. You see the world in colors I can only dream of. That makes you the most interesting person in this room, by far." The connection was undeniable. It was the kind of spark Daniel thought was a myth after Maria died. It was a recognition, a realization that their histories, their scars, and their responsibilities weren't baggage. They were the very things that made them capable of understanding each other without a single spoken syllable. Daniel told her about Sarah, the first time he had spoken her name to a stranger in years. He signed about the final months in the hospital and the terrifying realization that he was going to be a father alone in a world that felt increasingly loud. Elena listened with her whole being. She didn't offer a platitude or a "sorry for your loss." She simply held his gaze, her eyes providing a safe place for his grief to exist. "I think Maria would be proud of the man you are tonight." Elena signed softly, her movements gentle. "She would be happy that you didn't let the noise turn you cold. She would be happy you kept your hands open." As the cafe began to wind down and the staff started to dim the lights to signal closing, Daniel and Elena were the last ones left. They had traveled through years of history in 3 hours. The silence of the room was no longer a barrier. It was a sanctuary. Daniel realized that his co-workers' joke had backfired spectacularly. They had intended to create a moment of isolation, but they had unwittingly facilitated a moment of absolute union. They had tried to mock a language they didn't understand, only to find that it was the only language that could actually reach Daniel's heart. "Would you like to do this again?" Daniel signed, his hands a bit shaky from the weight of the question. "Maybe a walk along the river? Lily would love to meet you. She's been looking for an art teacher who actually talks her language, and I've been looking for a reason to stay out past 5. Elena's eyes shimmered with a sudden, overwhelming joy. She reached across the table and took Daniel's hands in hers, her skin warm and real. She signed one word, slow and deliberate, making sure the machine understood. "Yes." As they stood up to leave, the waiter, a young man who had been watching them with a quiet, respectful curiosity, offered a small nod. He didn't speak. He simply signed "thank you" with a clumsy but sincere gesture. Elena laughed and signed back, "You're welcome." Daniel walked her to her taxi. The London night air was crisp and smelled of rain and possibilities. As the taxi pulled away, Elena waved through the window, her hand making a sign that Daniel recognized immediately. It was the sign for home. Daniel stood on the sidewalk for a long time, the city hum surrounding him. He didn't feel like the machine anymore. He felt like a man who had finally found the missing frequency in his own life. He didn't know that tomorrow morning he would have to face the people who had tried to hurt him. But for the first time in 6 years, he didn't care about their noise. He had a secret. He had a connection that was louder than any shout. He had the truth in his hands. The next morning, the office at the logistics firm was buzzing with a different kind of energy. Mark and his inner circle were gathered by the high-end espresso machine, their eyes darting toward the entrance every time the door hissed open. They had their phones ready, eager to record Daniel's walk of shame. They expected him to be sullen, angry, or perhaps even more robotic than usual. When Daniel walked in at 8:55 a.m., he didn't look like a man who had been humiliated. He looked calm, rested. He walked to his desk, opened his laptop, and began reviewing the overnight shipping logs from Singapore with his usual precision. Mark couldn't wait. He strolled over, a smug, predatory grin on his face, his coffee cup held like a trophy. "So, Daniel, how was the big night? Did you and the artist have a lot to talk about? Or was it a bit quiet for your taste?" The surrounding co-workers snickered, leaning over their monitors, waiting for the punchline. Daniel didn't look up from his screen. "It was the most interesting dinner I've had in 6 years, Mark. Thank you for the recommendation. Her perspective on color theory is quite advanced." Mark's grin faltered. "That wasn't the script." "Really? No communication issues?" "I heard she's a bit difficult to reach. A bit offline, if you know what I mean." Daniel finally looked up. He looked at Mark with a steady clinical gaze that made the younger man shift uncomfortably. "She isn't difficult to reach, Mark. You just have to be willing to stop talking long enough to hear her. But then again, I suppose that requires a level of intelligence and empathy you aren't accustomed to using." The room went dead silent. The snickering stopped instantly. "What's that supposed to mean?" Mark snapped, his face turning a mottled red. Daniel stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't use a hostile tone. He simply pulled up a group chat window on the large communal monitor, a chat he had discovered when a junior broker had accidentally left their screen mirrored to the main display during a presentation. It was a string of cruel, mocking messages about the machine and the mute. "It means I know exactly why you arranged that date," Daniel said, his voice resonant and full of a cold, hard authority. "You thought it was a joke. You thought that because Elena is deaf, she was a punchline. And you thought that because I am quiet, I am stupid. You viewed her language as a deficit and my focus as a defect." He leaned across his desk, his presence filling the space. "But here is the data point you missed. My daughter is deaf. I have been fluent in British Sign Language for 9 years. I understood every word Elena signed, including the part where she mentioned that your recruiter was a rude, arrogant boy who didn't know how to look a person in the eye. The humiliation in the room was absolute. It was public." Mark looked as if he wanted to crawl into the floor vents. The co-workers who had laughed were now staring at their keyboards, suddenly overcome by an intense, burning shame. "I'm disappointed, Mark," Daniel added, his tone softening into one of genuine pity. "Not because of the joke, but because you spend your whole life measuring people by their disruptions and margins, yet you don't even know how to have a real conversation with the person sitting next to you. You're the one living in a world of silence, not Elena. You're the one who is truly disconnected." Daniel sat back down. He didn't report them to HR. He didn't demand an apology. He didn't have to. The machine had just performed a surgical strike on their egos, and they were officially offline. Elena texted him an hour later. "How was the office today? Did the boys ask for their report? I hope you told them I'm a terrible cook." "What?" Daniel typed back with a genuine, unburdened smile. "The report is filed, Elena. The system has been purged, and I told them you're the most eloquent person I've ever met. Are we still on for Sunday?" Lily is already practicing her artist face. "Yes," she replied. "Lily's art supplies are ready. I hope she likes silver glitter. It's very loud." Daniel realized then that he owed Mark a debt of gratitude after all. By trying to burn a bridge, the bully had accidentally shown Daniel exactly which path led to home. He closed his laptop at exactly 5 p.m. and walked out of the building. He didn't look back. He had a science project to finish, a daughter to hug, and a new life to start token, signing. The Sunday afternoon at the park was a masterpiece of color and quiet, vibrant joy. The sun was setting over the Thames, painting the sky in shades of liquid gold, deep violet, and a soft, hazy pink that Elena called the sound of a whisper. Lily and Elena were sitting on a large picnic blanket, surrounded by watercolor paints, sketchbooks, and an impressive amount of silver glitter. They were talking faster than Daniel could keep up with. Their hands were a blur of motion, a synchronized dance of stories about school, art, space travel, and the best way to draw a galaxy that felt real. Daniel sat nearby on a folding chair, drinking a cup of tea, watching them. He realized that for the first time in 6 years, his life felt stereo. He had his daughter, and he had a friend. The crushing silence in his heart had finally been replaced by a new, more honest kind of music. He watched Elena guide Lily's hand, showing her how to blend the blues into the blacks to create depth. There was no awkwardness. There was only flow. Elena looked up and caught his eye. She paused her signing with Lily and looked at Daniel with a look of profound, quiet warmth that made the cool evening air feel like midsummer. She raised her hand and signed one simple sentence, her movement slow and deliberate. "You listened before you even spoke." Daniel smiled, his eyes shimmering with a genuine emotion. He no longer felt the need to hide behind a machine persona. He signed back, "That's how I learned what really matters. I stopped waiting for the sound and started looking for the light." Lily tugged on Elena's sleeve, signing with a mischievous grin. "Is Daddy being a machine again? He looks very serious. Maybe we should put glitter on his shoes." Elena laughed, a sound that Daniel could feel in his own chest, and signed back, "No, Lily, he's just being a dad, and I think he's the best one in London. But yes, glitter on the shoes is a great idea." The story of the single dad and the joke date didn't end with a headline or a dramatic vow in a rainstorm. It ended with a simple, honest connection between 3 people who had finally stopped performing for a world that didn't understand them. Daniel Hayes was no longer a ghost in an office. He was a man standing in the light. True understanding isn't about the volume of your voice or the titles on your business card. It's about the courage to be quiet. It's about the willingness to see the person behind the mask. As they packed up their art supplies and walked toward the train station, the city lights began to twinkle like fallen stars. Daniel held Lily's hand on one side and Elena's on the other. He realized that in a world of endless noise, the most powerful thing you can do is hold the silence for someone else until they're ready to share it with you. The machine was home, and for the first time in 6 years, the rhythm was perfect. He looked at the silver glitter on his scuffed work boots and realized that some stains were worth keeping. True communication is not found in the words we speak, but in the attention we give. Never underestimate the power of someone who listens with more than just their ears. Integrity is a silent language, and those who speak it fluently are the ones who truly change the world. Sometimes the best response to a cruel joke is a life lived with absolute, quiet truth. If you believe that real understanding matters more than spoken words, subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever truly listened to someone without saying a single word? How did it change your perspective?